Hello, this is Ben, and today we're going to talk about a question that runs a little deeper than it needs to. Is racism biblical? I'm sure many people would say, of course not. But the reason I have to make this video is because there are way too many people out there who say that racism is totally biblical. Most people trying to justify racism in the modern world, they try to have some sort of scientific justification, like IQ is off, and you've got other people who say that like cultural factors are more dominant, yada yada yada, and stuff like that. But there's also these biblical justifications people give for their racism. So like one I heard when I was young is something people told me that sounded very much like something Mormons believe. I don't know why I keep coming back to Mormons. They're there. But like I was told when I was, I don't remember if I was actually a Christian or not. I was a kid in the kitchen, with an adult figure, some influential person in your life, and I was told that it's in the Bible. Racism's in the Bible, and I was like, "It is?" I didn't know it was in the Bible. It's in the Bible. And when this was told to me, it was like it's justified. You're supposed to be racist, and it was something about like. It was weird. It was like the Tower of Babel, and like there were certain groups of people who were like bad at that time, and so like they were like sent off to be the bad ones, and then so like the good ones were sent off to this other place or whatever. But it was told to me as a kid with like total certainty. Oh, you can flip the switch, and like I remember talking to like someone who this guy was a pastor and seminary trained and all that, nice guy, but like at the same time he told me that he thought we would still have our racial distinctions even in heaven. Which that would be interesting, that whole question of like salvation. If salvation and going to heaven is freely offered to all, it kind of runs counter to racism. And so he needed some sort of way to like maintain those distinctions. And so he grounded it in, there's a lot of mystery even in Christianity about the afterlife. I know people say like Christianity, the afterlife is so simple, it's heaven or hell. There's a lot of debate about, what the worst possible thing is and the best possible thing is. That's a big question. We've got information, but there's no way we could. I mean, how could you really, like comprehend that, and that sort of thing? But the racism question is definitely a question. There's an added question of racism and feuding, where it gets justified on you guys did this to us, and now we are doing it back to you. And so there's sort of that, where as long as that goes on, as long as that keeps, going back and forth like that, a feud, then like you can always point to a recent injustice. And another problem when it comes to, racism is it's not merely the racism. It's this like church tends to attract conservative minded people, and so a lot of times in Christian circles and at churches, you have people who like ideas just because they're old and hate ideas just because they're new. And so the problem is that if you go on back not too far, people were way more racist, and so that gets automatically labeled as good and better. And then you've got like, notable figures like Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. There's no way around it. Although there's certainly Christian leaders you can point to on the other side that, preached opposite things. So like during the Black Death, when the bubonic plagues spread through Europe, in the 1300s, I think in like 1350, although there were more outbreaks that were, so it was pretty severe. The estimates are anywhere from 30% of the population dying, because you got outbreaks and then like 20 years later another outbreak, and then you might have as much as 60%. Either way, this is a terrifying. It's hard to guesstimate, how many. But point is in Spain, the rumor spread that Muslims were poisoning the wells of Christians, but it quickly shifted over to saying that Jews were poisoning the wells of Christians. And so there was violence towards Jews. But the Catholic Church actually dealt with it quite quickly and said, absolutely not, and nipped it in the bud quite fast. And the only place that, like, during that particular period in history, the only place that, this is before the Protestant Reformation in, the 1300s, the only place that violence against Jews got going was in the Rhine Valley, in the cities of the Rhine Valley. And part of the problem there was that area was always politically very divided. There wasn't much of a political authority, and the church was never really, it was kind of like, it was always a little bit more of an anarchy region. There wasn't a lot of authoritative control. The church didn't even have much of a voice in that region. And so that region was always where anti-Jewish violence happened in Europe. Even if you go back to the oldest anti-Jewish violence, and even the violence, I think, against like heretical movements was still in the Rhine Valley. And that area, there's a geographical explanation. It's just like, it was never really clear like who's the boss there and who's the Catholic Church. It was always kind of like a backwoods country place to a degree, or a divided place, I guess. So you get what I'm saying. When we talk about anti-Semitism, and racism against Jews, of course, I live in the southeast United States, and so racism between blacks and whites is a thing. There's, of course, racism for the natives of this land. Of course, that's kind of a really simplistic way to put it, because like you've got the East Coast Indians, or the East Coast, you want to say natives, I guess would be more accurate. East Coast Native Americans, and then you've got the Plains Americans. You've got the Americans of the Northwest, the Native Americans of the Northwest. Then you've got like down in Mexico with the Mexicans. These are not, you can't lump all these different people groups as like just one group. They all have very different situations. So like the ones of the East Coast formed pretty powerful. When the white man came in, they figured out pretty quick that they could form like powerful alliances with each other, and were able to kind of have a political voice at the table. Part of the problem for them was they backed the wrong side in the Revolutionary War, and then that didn't go over so well for them. Whereas the Plains Americans, Native Americans, like, they kind of just got, there wasn't any kind of war they fall on the wrong side of or anything like that, Although, there were still travesties going on. The Cherokee shouldn't have been kicked off their land, but they were poor and in bad shape, and they had been that way for a long time. Down in Mexico, that's a different situation. The Mexica were a Maya tribe that moved back to maybe one of the first Maya cities was, and built the Aztec empire, but that empire was oppressive and tyrannical to all the surrounding tribes. And so when the Spanish conquistadors came, all the surrounding tribes actually joined up with them, because like what the Aztecs did is they would have a stone pillar in each village surrounding their empire, and when their guy showed up in town, there better be a young man or a young woman tied to that pillar for them to sacrifice to their gods. And they were a warlike people, who prided themselves on how many they killed and that kind of thing, and conquering their neighbors. That's a radically different situation from, some of these other groups. So you don't want to lump Mexicans in with like the Cherokee. That's really ridiculous, but there's no way the whole racism thing doesn't, carry a lot of weight for people. I was at the gas station the other day. I live in Georgia, and this young man looked to be in maybe no older than 25, but how can I know something like that for sure? But that's how he looked, at least. Pulled up in like a pickup truck getting gas. It was like way jacked up off the ground. And he had like the rebel flag like license plate, right? And it had I think a picture of the White House like on top of the rebel flag, like in the center. And it said across the top of the license plate, "I had a dream." And then at the bottom it said, "We need change." And it's like, wow, what is this guy talking about? Like, what's up with him? Like, so he wants the like South to rise again kind of thing. And like, your dream was the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, and we need to change and go back to that? Is that really what you think? Like, yeah, I mean, I was have to do everything I could not to ask that guy, like, what do you mean by that? Of course, he would get offended, and the fact that he would get offended means that he knows that like what he's saying is offensive. Like, he can't, say like, it can't be like if he was just riding a remote control car, he was just like really into, really fast remote control cars, and like he was driving one of those around. I'll say riding them around because I'm a dummy. He'd be driving it or controlling it, whatever. And like I said, oh, tell me about that. Then he wouldn't feel like threatened if I just asked, tell me about that, But if he has this tag on the front of his truck that says, it's got a rebel flag, and it says, "I had a dream, we need change." And I say, even if I don't want to debate him at all, I'm just like, tell me more. Because like my curiosity is a cup runneth over. I'm like, what does this kid think? Wow, and then like I know plenty of black guys, and like their view on things can be like a lot different from what you might think. Like, whenever they see a jacked up truck, they immediately think, well, that guy's a redneck, and they equate the term redneck with the term racist. Whereas a lot of white kids equate the term redneck with like being sort of a good old boy, like being low class, honest, truthful, common sense, salt of the earth, like virtue. It's like a virtuous life instead of, and they equate wealth and so like for a lot of white kids, like, like when they think of redneck, they think of like a person who doesn't have a lot of wealth and the corruption that comes from wealth. He's a good, honest, clean person, who doesn't have a bunch of college degrees to make him sound more important than he really is, kind of thing. Whereas a lot of black kids, like, they equate the term redneck with a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So like, it's interesting, because like there's actually a lot of crossover there, like overlap between the two concepts of the virtuous life are kind of like shun education, shun privilege, shun worldly status, so that you can be a truly good person in this world, and like both of those groups probably aspire to that, but when they use terminologies that like put them at odds with one another. So I mean, there's so much to say about the racism question, but the question we want to think about is not what scientific basis there is so much as what biblical basis is there for it. Now the thing is, the Bible affirms the mind-body distinction. So the science is relevant to the Bible. In other words, when I say mind-body distinction, I mean like that we have a brain and we also have a soul. So let's see if we can find some verses. Mind-body distinction in the Bible. It's certainly a philosophical idea. Now, there's actually a debate within Christianity about there's the two-part and what's called the tripart. The tripart view is that the Bible affirms a mind, body, and soul, which I believe that's actually can't think of the guy's name. He wrote Renovation of the Heart. Dallas Willard, he's tripart. Hugh Ross is tripart. The guy who runs some sort of like progressive creationist, like old earth apologetics thing. I can't think of the name of his ministry. Hugh Ross, yeah. And then like René Descartes for Descartes, he definitely affirmed the mind-body distinction. And the mind-body distinction, I mean, is all over the scripture, really. I guess they need a second to think about it, but like Paul's talking about the flesh and the spirit and the distinction between the flesh pulling us down and that kind of thing. I mean, it's all through the Bible, is that our thoughts and our actions are affected by our physical body, but there's also a spiritual side to us. But the connection, there is a strong connection to the physical. Here's one. Let's see if I can remember. It's a quote from Jesus. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay. Alright, so it looks like Matthew 26. I never really knew where that one was. Okay, so there's one from Jesus, right? Watch and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It says Matthew 26:41, so that means that that's probably in the garden there. I bet you. Let us see. Look at the whole chapter. All right, yeah, Jesus anointed. The Last Supper. Oh, so it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, so he returned. It says, verse 40, he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay, now the point for us right now is as far as the spirit, soul, body distinction versus just there's a spiritual side and a physical side, or what philosophers call the mind-body distinction, that a mind is not physical and the body is. It's not so much important as much as as Christians we do affirm that there is a physical component to your thought life. That we don't ground as Christians your choices and your actions and your beliefs completely in the spiritual. It's not as though you are a soul that just uses the body, but rather the body interacts with the soul, and it's a big part of what goes into what you think and believe, which would mean that scientific research on IQ, medicines that might help your brain, might help you deal with addiction, or maybe some sort of psychosis or mental disorder, those things can be legitimate for a Christian. So as a Christian, the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. Like, you may have a problem with your brain. So for example, I saw this one news special where this fella had, it was like a news sort of thing. This fella had brain damage, and he couldn't play the banjo anymore, and so they had him awake during brain surgery, and they shaved his head and taped a big tarp, so it was like a big curtain to his head, and then on the back side of it they took a saw and basically cut his whole head open, and they were connecting nerves with some sort of technique, and they were connecting different ones, and they were okay, play now, and he was and then they kept trying different ones, and they could tell when he started getting better, and they were and they connect this one wire basically, and they were play now, and he goes ding 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 ding, and it was whoa. Yeah. And from the Christian perspective, that wouldn't debunk Christianity, that at all. Like Jesus said, the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. That there's a physical component to your thought life. It's not purely spiritual, but there's a spiritual component too. As Christians, we affirm both. Okay. So the question of racism, first of all, these stories that people try to go back to the Old Testament to get some sort of story to ground it in, and it typically sounds more like Mormon nonsense than anything that's actually in the Bible. I mean, the Mormons have their scripture. They claim that they claim that some Israelites came and found North America on a boat. I think there was a storm or something, and one of them, named Laman, was a bad guy. He sinned a lot. And then the other one, named Nephi, he was really good guy. And so the Lamanites were the descendants of Laman, and the Nephites were the descendants of Nephi. And the Nephites were really good, and their skin got really white. And then the Lamanites, their skin got darker and darker brown because of how sinful they were. And yeah, so and it's not just that. On the Mormon view, you existed before you were born on this planet in they call it the pre-existence, in heaven, which is really a planet that orbits a star called Kolob, and their heavenly Father has sex with his many goddess wives and produces spirit children. And then we advance as far as we can in that form, and then we're sent to Earth so we can receive physical bodies, and then we advance more. You have to receive a physical body and do a whole bunch of other things if you want to become a god with your own planet. And so there was a plan to create Earth, and Jesus and Satan and everyone and you and me, we're all brothers and sisters, spirit baby children of Heavenly Father. Heavenly Father was born on some other distant planet as a spirit baby to his god and goddess, and parents, and he was sent to a planet and got a physical body. So the plan of advancement is the plan of salvation to them. Salvation means advancement. You're not really being saved from hell in the Mormon view. We could go, you're not going to go to hell unless you're the worst person ever. So there's nothing really that you're going to be saved from. It's just more advancing further. But they call that salvation. And if you don't do anything, if you're just a regular Joe Blow and you just die without being religious or anything, you go to heaven It's just the lowest level of heaven. But it's way awesomer than anything. That Joseph Smith said that, like, if you could see it, you would kill yourself instantly just so you could go there. So that's why we can't see it. Yeah. But it's important for you to achieve the actual God status and get your own planet. So you got to go through, like, all their teachings and stuff. And, like, you got to get married. You got to get married in the temple. Or else it doesn't count. And then you got to, like, there's like you can't be allowed in the temple unless you have a piece of paper called a temple recommend, which is like a certificate. It's based on, like, how you live your life, including whether or not you tithe. So you get the gist of it. But their thing is, like, Jesus, our brother, like, proposed that people on earth, when we are sent to earth, us on earth, would be given freedom of choice about whether or not we want to become gods. And just like had been done on other planets. But Satan, our other brother, like, he proposed that we would all just be forced to become gods. Because apparently, like, being sent to Earth, I guess you lose the memory of the pre-existence. It's part of the deal or something, the dealio. So, like, here's the point. All of the spirits who, like, there was a battle over this, and Satan and his teammates lost, and so they were cursed to never even be allowed physical bodies, so they can't become gods at all. And then the spirits who fought the most valiantly and all that, I'm going straight from the Ed Decker cartoon, but, like, it is the thing, like, you be born with whiter skin and that kind of thing, and then, like, if you didn't take a side and remain neutral, like the Swedish did in World War II, then you're born with black skin, and that means that, like, you can't all the way into the late 70s in the Mormon Church, you couldn't, like, come into, like, the priesthood, which the priesthood is, like, the first level of the plan of salvation / advancement. So, like, you can't ever get beyond the lowest level of heaven because you were neutral in the battle, and that's why you were born with black skin. So, like, as wacky as that sounds, sometimes you hear stuff like that, people trying to work, like, racism into, like, their into the Bible, So, like, the way they work it in, as I understand it, Noah had 3 sons, right? So, like, we're all descendants of Noah, because in the Great Flood, everyone dies except Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and who else? Their wives. So here's the thing. So it's kind of interesting, like, the most recent paternal, all of us are descendants of Noah, but we're not all descendants of Noah's wife, since it was Noah and his and his wife's 3 sons. So, like, they brought their wives who were not descendants of Noah or their wife because they weren't their sisters. So on our maternal side, as all of humanity, we're descendants of Eve and Adam, but then we're also all descendants of Noah on our paternal side, but not on our maternal side. So the most recent paternal common ancestor of all humans would be Noah, but the most recent common maternal ancestor of all humans would be Eve. That's neither here nor there. People take the whole thing of, like, all right, well, there's 3 of them, right? And Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so, like, people say that's, like, divides it all up. You got white people, Africans, and the Chinese. That's like literally like how like people drew that distinction. That, like, those were the 3 types of people there are, and there's no other flavors of people. That's it. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And even in World War II, the Nazis were heavily invested, and of course the Nazis were racist. They were heavily invested in like research or something. Like they went all over the world taking molds, casts of people's faces and sending them back. And it's actually a lot of important research now because they were so extensive in doing it, I think. But like they were working off this model of that went back to like the Bible with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Although I think the Nazis also believed that like the way the Jews happened. Okay, if I'm not mistaken, at least they said in their propaganda. I know they said in their propaganda that like a comet landed on Earth with like an advanced alien race on it, and that became Atlantis, and then some of those people mixed with gorillas, and that's how we get the Jews. So that's pretty racist. It's not very biblical, but the way that people ground it biblically is with the Shem, Ham, and Japheth thing. Now the issue is, when it comes to, we get down to the real biblical issues, like Shem, Ham, and Japheth would all be descendants of Noah and ultimately of Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are made in God's image, so there are certain unifying factors in all people there. So like, biblically speaking, all people are made in God's image. You can also, there's a debate over nature versus nurture. So like, you could do, what's called a natural law reasoning. In other words, just like, part of that would just be like literally just observing what people are like and stuff. But you can look at the different races of humans, and you can tell that we're all, we all possess uniquely human traits. So it just on a basic biological, anthropological observation, like how are you going to argue that like that people aren't people? So like, for example, one way people try to argue it is they talk about the Bushmen of the Kalahari and how they they have a language that involves clicks, and they use this as like some sort of evidence that these people aren't fully human or something. There's some sort of like missing link between the animals. People make that argument, although that argument is really poor, because that's just one example. That's just one example of the ways people try to justify their racism. Like that in the movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. They portray the Kalahari Sand people that way. They live in the desert as though it's the way it really is, but I think it's played more for laughs. When in reality, it was a way to give the movie a unique appeal and that kind of thing. But in reality, that's just a hunting language that they have. Like if you go to the actual camp, they speak a language just like I'm speaking to you, normal vocal, not with clicks, but normal vocal cord vibrations. But they have a separate language that they created just for hunting, because they still live off hunting. The sand people, like, the women buy some sort of basic grain, but the men, it's still very much a traditional tribal lifestyle in the desert, where the men just go out every day about noon when all the animals will be sleeping, and they just hunt, and they come back with something, and they cook it, and they eat it, and they just live that life with like the little huts and stuff, and they just live there, and that's like how life is lived, But that's just an example. You're going to be hard pressed to find evidence that these people aren't people. Especially if you compare them to animals. Like it's just no comparison. Like if you look at a chimpanzee's brain size, and then you find your race that you're racist against, what you're going to find is like the people you're racist against have a brain like the same size as yours, and the chimpanzee, which has, to my knowledge, has the largest brain of the other primates. Although a blue whale has a brain far larger than yours, but it has to. I mean, it's the biggest creature ever lived on this planet. But like as far as brain size goes, the chimpanzee brain, like if you look at like even a doggy's head or a chimpanzee head, they have like huge jaw muscles on the side. And so most of what, you rub that dog's head, you feel that he likes that because he's got like giant jaw muscles. There's like a little small brain in between those huge muscles. Whereas your brain is mostly little thin jaw muscles because you're designed to eat cooked food and tender food. You boil your vegetables or steam them or whatever. Okay, chimpanzees don't do that. I mean, I think it's obvious to anyone that like we clearly have powers of reason that excel beyond those of an animal. And it's clear that no matter what race you're looking at that you have decided is dumber than your race, and yet it tends to boil down to like something intellectual. They're clearly not animals. They clearly have powers of reason that like dwarf those of animals. I mean, so like you would be impressed with a chimpanzee if it could make a macaroni sculpture. You'd be really impressed. The stuff that like is a challenge for a 5-year-old. So I don't care who you are. Even mentally handicapped people have abilities that like go far beyond those of any animal ever. Like I've known people who are severely mentally handicapped. Like one kid who like he's like 25 or whatever, and he still can't pass the 2nd grade. He's got severe problems, and yet he still can do all sorts of things. Like he can communicate with you verbally. He's not as good as you would like for him to be, but like he knows way more than a gorilla or a monkey. Okay, he can drive. Could you imagine a dog or even a monkey driving? Or showing up for work on time, understanding how to read a clock, understanding how to like hand the the lady a 20, like telling jokes, even if they're really corny and lame jokes. What jokes do animals tell? Listening to music, even if it's corny and lame music, So like the way you have to justify your racism, it was going to be like, you're going to have to create some sort of special category, an in-betweensy category. The interesting thing there is we have a lot of research and evidence that like the main people group that mixed with Neanderthals, and so it's clear we have a lot of bones, and the best evidence indicates that like there were in-betweensy categories like Neanderthals and Homo erectus, and like they clearly they weren't modern humans with modern human abilities, but like there's one people group that interbred with them. The best evidence we have, as I understand it right now, is that no humans are descended from Neanderthals. They're not like the missing link of evolution, but we do have their DNA, and what we find is that Europeans, or the white people, mixed with them when they entered Europe, because the Neanderthals were already there. So the first Europeans interbred with them. So that kind of flies in the face of the whole thing. It's like, okay, these are the people that everyone says are smarter. Unless you're racist against white people, then you justify it. That justifies it. So yeah, you could create your in-betweensy category, but one of the that's a question that needs to be dealt with. But one thing we can recognize is this whole issue of being made in God's image is rather mysterious. The ramifications of it are immense. First of all, in Genesis, you've got God creating the world, and it's a step by step creation, and then the final creation is the image of God. And so one observation that's been made about this is similar to the creating of a temple. And so the last thing you build a temple, and the last thing you put in the temple is the image, the idol, the image of the God. And so for humans, the image of the God is us. Right? Now, there's more to it than that. If humans are made, and this is the argument that Gregory of Nyssa made, I think around 350 AD. Or maybe I'm getting my, let's see. Gregory of Nyssa. He's a Christian. Okay, yeah, I was pretty close, about 350. It says he lived around, we don't know for sure, 335 to 395, so that's 60 years. Bishop of Nyssa from 372 to 376. And that's probably when he preached this. He said that if everyone's made in God's image, then that would teach that would lead to a doctrine that slavery is a sin, on the basis that you cannot purchase a human being. And so, and what he said was like, if someone's made in God's image, then how much should you pay for the image of God, made by God, of himself? God's like self-portrait. Okay, it would have to be priceless. You can't set a price on that. And so this is an argument for the infinite value of all humans, that all humans are infinitely valuable. So we can start to lay down some stuff like, okay, first of all, it's clear just from just observation of the natural world that humans possess powers of reason that dwarf all the animals, which lines up with Genesis and a distinction made between humans and all animals. And they even dwarf those of the hominids, the halfway in betweens. Although the hominids seem to have really be like they must have had some sort of language, very simple language, but they're nowhere near what we're doing. They used tools like spears, but they were very, very poorly made, and the first humans were making far better ones, and fish hooks and art. I think no Neanderthals did art. They didn't bury their dead. They didn't have division of labor, organization. They couldn't manage to live in groups bigger than 25, although they may have had fire. So here's the point. This issue of being made in God's image, if all humans are infinitely valuable, that immediately flies in the face of a lot of racism. You want to look down on somebody because of their race, but then you've also got to say that person is infinitely valuable. Unless you can somehow justify and say that that person is not a human being. And if they're not a human being, then you have to say, what are they? And then what you have to say is, well, they are some sort of other thing that you postulate exists, But then the question arises, like, where did you get a basis for believing in the existence of that other thing? What evidence do you have for that? In other words, this is a burden of proof question. I could tell you that, my favorite example is if I say that on Tuesday nights I play poker with Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and Abraham Lincoln. You are under no compulsion to believe me unless I provide evidence for that, because I could make an infinitely variable amount of claims that I cannot back up. And if you have to defeat them all one by one or else they're true, then that would lead to absurdity. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, made the same argument in the case for the existence of God. He said he doesn't have to believe in God until someone gives him evidence. He said, so you could claim to me that there's a teapot on Mars, and you can't disprove Russell's teapot, so that means it exists, that kind of thing. I could claim to you that if you don't eat a candy bar at exactly 4:35 tomorrow, then on Wednesday the moon will crash into the earth and kill everyone. Are you going to do it? You know, and I could say like, oh no, like if you don't do it, the moon will crash into the earth. So why don't you just eat the Snicker bar? You know, because even if there's no reason to believe in me, think of the consequences. But it's like, it still matters. What are the odds that that's true? You're probably not going to eat the Snicker bar at 4:35. You're not going to worry about that, even though it's not a big deal to do it. And the consequences would be disastrous. The problem is I can just make up anything like that and get you to do anything with that rule. You know, people do that. You know, it's kind of like an environmentalism argument sometimes, or just, you know, different ways people like say that, like, let's just do this even though we don't know if it's going to happen. It's like, well, think about the logic of what you're saying. Like, if we just do stuff without any reason to think that it's likely to happen, then we're just, you know, you're going to be eating the Snicker bar at 4:35 tomorrow. You know, because I can just say that for no reason at all, the moon will crash into the earth if you don't do it. So that means you have to do it, right? So in other words, if you come to me and you claim that there's some sort of other group of creatures, you have to provide for me evidence. I'm under no obligation to believe in that until you provide evidence. You have to provide for me some sort of evidence. And the problem with providing this evidence is there's a lot of variation within humanity that we know has to be there. Because you can look at one race of people and see tremendous variation within that race. And so, and then you've got the doctrine of free will, which is clearly all throughout the scriptures. I mean, the scriptures are filled with commandments. The very nature of a commandment implies that, like, a human is responsible for his or her own actions. So, you know, we don't have total free will, because total free will would mean, freedom of the will just means control. And so control of the will. So, like, we don't have control over everything, but we have control over, like, some things, our thoughts, or at least whether or not we obey or disobey these commandments. I mean, if God commands us to obey them, then what follows directly from that, the reasoning that comes directly from that is we have a choice. All right? And if we have a choice, then that means you can get people who disobey all of them and people who obey all of them. That means that there's a tremendous amount of possible variation that has nothing to do with race. And so what that means is it's going to be very difficult for you to justify that a person, you know, is some sort of, you know, not a human. The other issue that we run into is if you've dealt with mentally handicapped people, what you find is, like, first of all, they're not necessarily going to be, they come in all races. You don't find a race of people that doesn't have them. The other problem is, you know, you might say, well, this race has more of them, but that still doesn't, that's not really the relevant point. The relevant point is, like, they can be in any race. And then the problem is you come to find that they're very human. They have very, very distinctive human markers, emotional qualities, emotional baggage, arrogance, pride, like all you know, if, in other words, like, all of the sins and virtues are there. If you really have much interaction with these people. And if these people are clearly still human, then it's just ridiculous to assert that, like, you know, that this other, you know, race of people isn't human. So you run into a lot of problems. Now, one thing about racism is you could the other issue is, as you move forward, I guess, is what we talked about in some of our other videos here. Paul makes it clear, he talks about human equality, and he says, you know, in Christ we're all equals. Let's see if we can look some of that up for you. Okay, Galatians 3. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think it was Galatians. Yeah, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male nor and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So unity. Yeah. Romans 10, the same thing. No distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all. Colossians 3, do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge and after the image of its creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. And of course, to be labeled barbarian to the Colossian church, you know, these converted Greeks who had become Christians, that would have been the worst racial slur. That's a racial slur. A severe one. Okay, Paul even claims here, Acts 7, I forgot about the preaching at Mars Hill to the Athenians. He's talking about God. He says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. And here's an important point we don't want to miss. Of course, John 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. And it's important. That's absolutely essential in Christianity, is that salvation is a personal matter. You have to make a choice to believe or not believe. It's up to you. You will not be saved based on what anyone else does. No matter what. So you're not going to heaven based on your race or going to hell based on your race. You have a choice in the matter. And so, I mean, that's really goes back to what that preacher guy was telling me. He was trying to make a claim that there will be some sort of racism that continues in heaven because of this. Because salvation is open to every single person, and it's a personal matter. Anyone can be saved. So that alone has a lot to do with racism. Then, of course, we've got the fundamental belief teaching in Christianity is Romans 3:23 says it very succinctly, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, no, not one. Of course, he's quoting the Old Testament there. So, according to God's perspective, all of us deserve to go to hell forever. Every one of us. So, from a biblical perspective, how dare you ever think that you are superior to another person? If we were to look at your life and make a judgment over your life and give you what you have earned and deserve in your life, you would go to hell forever. Right? So, the racism question certainly ties back to the pride question, doesn't it? Alright. Alright. Yeah, of course, the Jesus famously sums up the Ten Commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Mark 12. Alright. Okay. Here's Acts chapter 10. So Peter opened his mouth and said, truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Alright. The slavery in the New Testament question, I guess, is going to have to be addressed. Alright. First Timothy 2:4 is talking about God. It says, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So it's clearly, this is going to fly in the face of racism. And so that's probably why. as I understand it, I could be wrong, but as I understand it, historically, the shift to basing racism off of saying that people, certain groups of people, aren't actually human, has to do with passages like this that claim that all nations and all humans are equal, we're all one in Christ Jesus, we're all sinners, and we all deserve to go to hell. So you have to say, well, then these people aren't actually people. The problem is like, it gets, you're going to have to sit back and say, all right, well, they're not animals, are they? They're clearly a lot more like people than animals, all right? I mean, you pick a race that you're racist against. Okay, the Jews. They've got more Nobel Prizes for science than any other race. Okay, what animal has that? Let's say you're racist against Africans. Well, Africans, I mean, let's just look at what they've done artistically. Blues and jazz, and then you take any blues song and speed up the tempo, and you get a rock and roll song. Okay, if you want to look at artistic innovations, it's hard. You can't ever ignore that. What happened here in the Southeast United States is tremendous. Everyone listens to music that's ultimately derivative of black artistic creativity. And art is a primary indicator of not being an animal. Animals don't do art. Okay, I've seen a doggy do art. Chimpanzees, as far as I know, no Neanderthals either. It's just, and we're talking about good art that everyone in the world wants to copy. So, there you go. I mean, what race are you going to be against? I guess you could be against white people. Well, the problem there is that white people created science and all of the technology that comes with it, our modern concepts of democracy, freedom, individual liberty. It was a battle, but they weren't created by other races. You could say, well, the white people didn't exactly always do that. Well, no, but they were the only people who even tried, and eventually they got it together. No other race in the world ever even thought to get rid of slavery. And if you say, well, white people didn't get rid of it, some white people wanted to get rid of it, and some didn't. It's like, well, yeah, but it was only among white people that, like, the idea that slavery is wrong even emerged. And all of these things that created the modern world is all ultimately white people, you know. So like, you get all these like absurd attempts of people to like claim that like, well, they stole that from like the Chinese or the Muslims or that kind of thing, and it's absurd. Like, Muhammad owned slaves. The Chinese had an oppressive, tyrannical government that just like extracted things from people. I don't know, who are you going to be, you know? I guess you could be racist against Muslims today. But I mean, like, that's kind of ridiculous. Animals don't order their lives in the way that Muslims do, according to these very, 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 very strict rules and regulations. Animals don't really have these whole systems of commandments and like beliefs of obligations and like that like are so heavy in Islam. Animals don't have a concept of commandments, you know, like reading. And the Quran is beautiful, is it not? And that is like their ultimate miracle. Just how beautiful the Quran sounds. I mean, like, that's ridiculous. To say that Muslims aren't people, and not to mention Islam's not a race. It spreads all. It's huge. Like it spreads all over the world across many races. So I mean, that's not even relevant. I mean, who are you going to be racist against? What, the Chinese? The Chinese certainly didn't create the modern world, but like a lot of the technologies that the Western white people gave to the world through the modern world were actually created in China. Now, not all. A lot of them that people think were created in China weren't. The Chinese made the mistake of not capitalizing on these technologies, and what always the problem was in Asia and in the Eastern nations in general is they felt like progress was a threat to order. And again, that's just intrinsically a human thing, like to even worry about that. even to contemplate like the ramifications of progress. Yeah. So now part of the issue with racism that you run into is like, first of all, racism's bad and you shouldn't be racist. But like, how do you deal with it now that it's here? You know, every person has their own free will to make their own choices in life. Yes, who you are biologically is going to be a factor in how you live your life, but ultimately, when it comes down to obeying the commandments of God, it's up, you know, your race is not going to determine that. You know, so like, one person may have an issue with gambling. Another person may have an issue with homosexuality. And certain issues may be predominantly prevalent in a certain race. But the Bible seems to make it clear that what a person does, at least in terms of obeying or disobeying God's commandments, is the fault of that person. And so you cannot really worry about much else. If a person is obedient to the commandments of God, they're doing pretty good. They're doing better than everyone else. So any other distinctions you might draw outside of that are not really that big of a deal. You can, you know, the fact that you're a big smelly sinner is ultimately not the fault of the race you're born into. It's the fault of you. So and then the Bible's quite clear that salvation can be found in Jesus Christ, not just from what's going to heaven or going to hell so you can go to heaven after you die, but actually to be rescued from sin itself. You know, we was talking about in Galatians 5, is like, we have the sinful nature in us and it produces all sorts of evil acts. But if we walk with the Spirit, then Christ will save us on the inside, and then it will produce things in us against which there is no law, the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. So I want to ask, and he says, against such things there is no law. So I mean, that's kind of Paul's little joke there, but it's quite interesting. Like, what problem would you have with a person who's constantly loving, peaceful, patient, generous, kind? You know, Peter says the virtues that we are supposed to strive for, virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love, true, deep Christian love. He says that we are supposed to strive for those as much as we can, and through that we'll overcome the sin in our hearts. It's not that we'll just become better people, as much as trying to do those things will be how Christ works through us to make us into better people, to make us just want to be better people. So it's like, the example I use is like the walls of Jericho. You walk around the wall with, you know, singing and dancing, and you're just obeying God, doing your thing, but it's not going to make the walls fall down. God will make the walls fall down. So you do these things, those 7 things, and then God will change you from the inside out. Well, I mean, if you look at those things, virtue, which means, literally that just means living the good life in every sense of the word. That was a Greek concept that Peter was using there. But knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. What problem could you have with someone if they're always doing those in increasing measure, and then that's giving them victory over the sin of their heart? Like, what problem would you have with somebody if that's who they are? What kind of horrible person would you have to be to still have a problem with somebody like that? Okay? So that is one issue. It's like, I don't think racism is really biblical. I mean, the best you can do is you can like assert that there's some sort of in-betweensy people, but just observationally that seems absurd. Even in my own personal observations of mentally handicapped people, it's absurd. So we're all humans, and therefore all of these scriptures that I read to you, there's no reason to think that they don't apply to all people. Okay, so after I'm telling you all of this, I just want to go back and like that guy who had the like, what does he think about this stuff? Has he thought about it? Like, how does he rationalize in his head? That guy that had the rebel flag license plate that said, "I had a dream, we need change." Like, what was his dream? Like, did he really want slavery to continue indefinitely? I talked about Gregory of Nyssa, and his argument that slavery is really a sin. Paul's position there in Ephesians 6, I probably just need to do a video on slavery, but like Paul's position there in Ephesians 6 is that, like, if you are a slave and you're a Christian, you continue to obey your earthly master, not because he is your master, but because Jesus is your master, and that's what Jesus wants you to do. You're not a slave of the human anymore, you're a slave of Jesus. But the master is supposed to do the same for the slave, which means obey him. So it's like obey each other. And this would eliminate the slavery within the Christian household and create equality, where two people essentially do things together because they agree. Paul says, if I remember correctly, in 1 Corinthians 11, he says if you're a slave, don't seek to escape. Stay in the situation you're in, whatever your situation is, and you become a Christian, stay in your situation. But if you can get free, get free. He says that. So, like, the issue is that becoming a Christian was a rebellious act against the entire authority of the Roman Empire. So Paul also says in Romans 13 that, like, we're supposed to obey the government. And this is like the last video I did, is like, essentially should Christians always obey the government? Well, the issue is that Christianity should not be spread by force. So it's not a rebellion to set up a political system. And so as much as we can get along with the government, we will. And so the law would in the Roman Empire would prohibit slaves from leaving their masters. And so what Paul's saying is, even if the master and the slave are both Christians, even in that situation, they shouldn't seek manumission or freedom of the slavery except through the proper legal means. But that within that household, the slavery is gone. You treat each other like absolute equals. Just because you don't want to, Christianity is not supposed to be a rebellion against the entire government, a political rebellion. We're going to take up weapons to take down the government, but rather that Christianity is spread through winning the argument and loving people. And then so that moves to other questions like, what do you do when, Christians now run the government and it's no longer an evil Roman Empire government? Because see, the issue is that it was illegal in the Roman Empire to be a Christian. And so Christians were supposed to obey, obviously disobey the government on that, but anywhere they can obey the government, they will, to try to win people over. So slavery is not something that the Bible supports, but people made that claim, especially in the South before the Civil War. They would quote the verse like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters as is fitting for the Lord, as though you are serving Christ." And then they leave out the next verse that says, "Masters, do the same for your slaves, because Christ is your master too, and do not threaten them." Well, how do you make a slave obey you as the master of the slave without threatening the slave? If you can't threaten them, then they're not really your slave. Because you're not gonna. If you're not, in other words, don't make them do anything. That's what that means. Don't make them do anything. In no way threaten them. So any punishment of force starts with a threat. Like, if there's no threat of anything, like you're not going to kill their kids or take away anything from them, then that's human. That's an equal relationship. So the ramifications of that were worked out through the Middle Ages. That would be interesting to take a look at. It leads to the feudal system, where it's like shared, like both people kind of have a say-so in the relationship in the feudal system of the Middle Ages. So like the serf can't really leave the land, but the serf the land belongs to the lord of the land, and the serf has to pay rent. But the serf manages his own time. His children are not subject to sale or anything like that. He can marry who he wishes. But then also in the feudal system, the lord is supposed to provide the serfs with protection from anyone out there. So they provide the serfs with safety. And then the serf provides them with work. They have to stay on the land. They can't just move. But if the lord wants to, like, marry the princess of the next kingdom over, he has to get approval from the group of the serfs. So there's like that's how you work out the whole idea of, like, we're obeying each other. And this is where Parliament comes from, the House of Lords and House of Commons, from the French parley, or parlor, right? To have a talk. So, like, there were all sorts of things that everyone had to get approval from everyone else for everything. And so it was more of like a communal thing. Eventually that moved to a shift to peasant people being peasants, which were like, instead of serfs, where they were free and paid and they could move and go different places and take different job opportunities and that sort of thing. And so, like, what happened then, I guess, is more history of, like, how this played out, is, like, the Black Death happened, and so there was a shortage of laborers, and so serfdom went down, and more people were becoming peasants because it was a better economic situation, because they were, like, the laborers were getting paid more because there was a shortage of labor, and so you had to pay more for labor. And technology was improving, and so more and more people were wanting to pay more for labor. The royalty and the ruling classes didn't like this because they felt like peasants were starting to get rich and start to rival them in wealth. And so there were less and less serfs, and there were more and more peasants. So different nations started passing laws in the 1300s to freeze or maximum pay laws. Like, you can't pay peasants more than this and that kind of thing. And then no one was obeying them. Eventually you had peasants rebel. So you had a fascinating thing happen where, for the first time in history, the poor people in the society rebelled, and the only thing they were asking for, and the only thing they were fighting for in the rebellion, was their rights as poor people. And I think there were 3 rebellions in the 1300s in France, England, Tyler's rebellion, and then the other one in the Netherlands. But it's the first time that ever happened in history where poor people weren't trying to take over and become the rich people or kill or take all the gold and the booty, but, like, they just wanted their rights as poor to be respected. That never happened in history before. But those rebellions were all squashed by the political powers that be, by the powerful, the rich and the powerful. But the thing was, it didn't really affect anything. The tide of the shift to paying people more, there were people out there who were wanting to make money, capitalists basically, who, like, I want to attract these workers over here. I've got this. I'm gonna build my water mill or my mine, or I've got my farm, and I'm gonna make more money than that guy down the road, and I'm gonna pay these guys more, and they're gonna come work for me, and I got this great idea, and it's gonna be this great thing. And so this kept driving wages up. And so that kept on going on, and, like, as much as the government, was at odds with it, they couldn't stop it. So you can see how these things work out. But it's interesting, the point I'm making there is an evolution. You can see the intermediate steps. Serfdom is clearly not slavery. It's clearly an intermediate step on the way to our modern concepts. And then, like, it takes a long time to get to where we are today, because even 100 years ago in America, women had just gotten the right to vote, and poor people had just gotten the right to vote, I think, 4 years before women. But our modern concepts of everyone should have a right to say in how they're governed flows from this long evolutionary track that goes back to these ideas here. All right, so these biblical concepts of human equality and that kind of thing. So, like, it'd just be interesting to say, like with that guy who has like the rebel flag on there, like if he's going to quote Ephesians 6, I would just want to ask him, like, what about the next verse where it says, like, slaves do the same for your masters and do not threaten them because Christ is your master and he shows no partiality. Wait, what? Okay. So I mean, it's clearly Paul's teaching human equality. Okay, so like the big question that we need to think about is like how to deal with racism, I think, because it's clear, again, let's just be clear, the Bible's replete with verses that talk about human equality, so the only way you can justify racism is by saying that certain people aren't actually people, they just appear to be people. The problem is they clearly have, if they're not people, then I'm not a people. Like what exactly is going to be this distinction? And so essentially you can look at European excellence and say, look at there, but then you've got African excellence in art that like Europeans, can't rival. And so you got to say, look at there, and then even, if you, I know Muslims aren't a race, but like there's certain characteristics of that group of people. There's levels of devotion and that like are clearly human, that like things that Europeans lack. So there's no way you can rule any of these races out from being human, and like all of the evidence is against you if you want to make that case, all of it. And then you've also got the problem of the commandments of God. If you have the free will to obey or disobey them, then the range of possibilities for what a human can be like are so immense that like what distinctions would even matter? In other words, if a person can be so close to Christ or so close to Satan, then what else do you care about? Because inside that range of obeying all the commandments and then disobeying all the commandments, it's such a broad range, and all of those count as humans because those commandments are given to humans, then like, and the gospel salvation is given to humans, then like anything that's outside of that range is not a big deal. Who cares? Okay, so the question is like, the real question is like, why does racism persist and how to deal with it? Part of the reason I think it persists is because different races have perpetrated different evil acts in the past, like, and then that leads to a repercussion, it leads to a rebound. So like, and then that comes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I mean, probably one of the best examples would be the Palestinians and the Israelis, right? I mean, A wrongs B, B wrongs A wrongs B wrongs A. It's the boomerang effect. It's the boomerang effect. Now, Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. He said in Matthew, I think 5, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. So, that commandment from Christ, those commandments, would completely stop the boomerang effect. Now, one example is, of course, who is it? Dylan Roof. He's got a weird name. Is it Roof? It's Ruth. Let's look him up. So this kid is a really racist little white kid who went to a black church and shot everybody. It's Roof. R-O-O. Look at him. Dylan Roof. Alright, born in 1994. He's 24 now. But as I understand it, he laughed. He made video confessions before he did it. He wanted to ignite a race war. Alright. During a prayer service at Emmanuel African Methodist AME Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, Roof killed 9 people, all African Americans, including senior pastor and state senator Clementa C. Pinckney, and injured 1 other person. After several people identified Roof as the main suspect, he became the center of a manhunt that ended the morning after the shooting with his arrest in Shelby, North Carolina. He later confessed that he committed the shooting in hopes of igniting a race war. 3 days after the shooting, a website titled The Last Rhodesian. The Last Rhodesian. Does Dylan Roof think he's from Rhodes? Rhodes is an old Greek city-state. Huh. Alright. Was discovered and later confirmed by officials to be owned by Roof. The website contained photos of Roof posing with symbols of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, along with a manifesto in which he outlined his views towards blacks, among other peoples. He also claimed the manifesto to have developed his white supremacist views after reading about the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin and black-on-white crime. Charleston church shooting, June 17, 2015. So he's 24 now. In 2015, he was, what, 20? He was sentenced to death. He pled guilty. It's kind of hard not to. He got a life sentence in prison without parole instead because he pled guilty. Wait. To avoid a second death sentence. Alright. He's sentenced to 9 consecutive sentences of life without parole after formally pleading guilty. Alright. So, the point is I saw it that these old black ladies in the church made a point to have a special hearing in the court where they came in there and with tears in their eyes they said they forgive him and they love him and they pray for him and they don't want to kill him. So in other words, those people in that church have a reason to hate not just Dylan but any group of people that he, especially if he wasn't a lone actor in that, then if he's not a lone actor, if say a group of people was behind that, then it's unlikely they would have caught all of that group. And then some sort of response would be perpetrated by the blacks against this white supremacist group. And then that would hurt other people that weren't part of the original offense. And so then they would respond back and it gets messy and it doesn't get clearly divided who did what to who, so there's always bystanders and extras, and so it would go on back and forth unless someone come in there and said, just because those old black ladies did, they came in there and they forgave him. And so that's one of the first things you're going to have to do if you're going to end racism is just because someone, no matter how bad it is or no matter how trivial it is, wrongs you because they're racist, you forgive them and let it go. And you don't try to get back at them for it. That's absolutely essential. So I don't care if it's something simple. And so that part of the problem is not just is that oftentimes when it's simple, we feel like it's okay to have to get back at them in a simple way, to pay them back. So if it's just a little tiny amount of racism, we feel like it's okay to have a little tiny amount of retribution. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's saying love your enemies, pray for those that persecute you. Luckily, Dylan Roof was, like I said, he had social withdrawal. He didn't have a job, a driver's license, and just stayed in his room a lot of the time. Huh. Even though he said a lot of racist stuff, but some of his friends in school were black. Okay. So that's interesting. Alright, so. Alright. Oh, Rhodesia is an old name for Zimbabwe? Okay, let's look up Rhodesia. I thought Rhodesia is not the same as Rhodes. I was thinking of the ancient Greek city of Rhodes. So Rhodesia was an unrecognized state in southern Africa from 1965 to 1979, equivalent in territorial terms to modern Zimbabwe. It was considered a de facto successor state to the former British colony of Southern Rhodesia. Alright. So there was some racist stuff that went on there. I don't see why that had anything to do with Dylann Roof. Alright. So, I think that's the first bit of information. You know, one of the first things we need to address is, like, you don't return retribution like that. That's absolutely essential. One of the issues that comes up today with racism is, today people call it intersectional racism. I think they just say intersectionality, although it's sort of a social justice warrior term, and from what I can understand, the SJW thing is like a hipster thing, the way it looks to me. Like, I was reading one article, and the person was just throwing around intersectionality like it was a cool thing to know about. The t-shirts seem cool, they have their own way of dressing, it's like kind of a subculture, they have their own lingo. It just reminds me of emo kids when I was in college. Like, it's just cool to be SJW today. But the intersectional thing is like, the issue there is, you are the benefitter. So, like, let's say you're white. You benefit from racism even if you're not racist, because, like, you might, someone out there might, the society, there's someone out there in the society that's racist somehow that benefits someone. So, like, maybe your parents benefited in some minor way, and that trickles down to, like, them having a little more money to benefit you a little bit more. And then, like, if you can imagine, if there's enough of those just few rotten eggs in the society that can benefit enough people, you know, to cause all sorts of, like, awesome stuff for you just because you're white. And so the issue there is, like, you're benefiting from something, you have no control over the fact that you benefit from it. So that's a issue with racism that's, like, gets a little bit tricky, because it's like, I didn't do anything, I didn't even notice that happened, but it's like, apparently it's really bad, you know. And that's essentially holding someone responsible for benefits they received from someone else. So, like, for example, let's say that, here's the argument that they made against Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, they wanted to make her a saint, and Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheist voice, was devil's advocate, which is like a position that when they want to saint someone, you have to have someone make the argument against it. And if they feel like that's the best argument you can make against sainthood, and the person should still be sainted, well then, okay, we'll saint the person. So I think Christopher Hitchens claimed that he was the first person to ever be devil's advocate pro bono, and which means for free. And he was devil's advocate against old Mother Teresa. And the primary argument he made, as far as I understood it, the main case he made against Mother Teresa is, like, there were really, 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 really crooked people, evil, like, mobsters and gangsters who did horrible things, and they donated to her. They just gave her money. And then she used that money to feed the poor and the starving. So, if that's the best argument you can make, Christopher, it's like, what does Mother Teresa carry? The question is, what does she do with what's given to her? It's not a question of what's given to her. If she's going to use that money for everything that those people don't believe in, then, like, good for her. You know? And it's the same way, like, if some racist guy gives me money but just because I'm white, he just, like, mails me $100. Well, the question is not whether or not I benefited from someone's evil. The question is what I do with what I have control over. You know, I mean, I guess if like I could like say I don't want you giving me that money anymore, but like if it's benefits that I don't like, you know, because like by receiving it, I might be in a way encouraging that person's racism, and that's irresponsible of me. But if it's something, if it's benefits I'm receiving that I don't even realize I'm receiving, and because it's not even being given to me, it's just being given, like there's just somewhere in there a white person benefits, and that has a trickle web effect of benefiting, like fundamentally I'm not responsible for that. I'm responsible for what I do with what I see. So I'm responsible for whether or not I see someone in need and help that person. You know, if someone gave something to me and it was immoral for them to give it to me, the question is not whether or not they gave that to me. The question is what I do with what I own, with my property, you know, and who I benefit with it. So I just don't see a big case to be made there. That sounds more like an explanation for why, you know, black people, I guess, in America aren't as rich. Although, I mean, I don't even know, are they not as rich? I mean, like, they might, I'm not saying they're not, but like, I don't feel like I'm an authority on that, because I could hear someone right now coming back at me and say, actually they're doing pretty well now, and you know, you're outdated. That's the way it used to be 10 years ago, blah blah blah. I'm like, okay, whatever. So I don't want to you know, comment on like their situation, because that's not really talking about I guess a biblical view of racism. I guess to some degree that's part of it, though. Maybe we need to talk about that. But the other thing is like the whole unconscious bias. And I think old Ben Shapiro has a good point about unconscious bias. Is like people have all sorts of conscious biases, but it doesn't necessarily lead to actions. So like I may be aware of all sorts of evil desires in my heart, which this is entirely a biblical point. And that doesn't mean that, like, in other words, like they're saying like you're unconsciously racist against this person. It's like, well, what about conscious bias? Like, you know, it doesn't have to be racism. It can be like, I just don't like that person because they get on my nerves. But I don't have to act in a way that is unloving or uncaring towards that person, because I can face temptations and not give in to them. So internal bias should not be equated. I mean, it can lead to action, but there's a free will distinction there. You know, like there's just that's the question of, you know, I think we've established that in here, that like you are responsible for what you do, and it's not going to be just based on your internal bias. I mean, that ultimately sounds like just a racist concept, that like you, sir, have within you things that make you do evil things and you're not even aware of it, and it's just in there and you can't help it. And why? Well, it's because of your race. And that's a racist thing to say, and it just, that doesn't agree with the Bible, the idea that like the commandments were given to all, and it's up to each person to decide whether or not they obey them. And the temptations of the sinful nature face us all, not some of us. They might be different for different persons, but that's not really all that relevant, given that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that the temptations that face you are common to man. Yeah, and I think we all recognize that we're capable of being pretty bad enough. Like, we don't need to worry about who's, you know, any distinctions between people wouldn't be that big of a deal. It'd be quibbling over the itty bitties. So what we need to address is there is an issue where people want to comment on like why a certain group of people, it's just terrible for them, and you know why their situation is the way it is. And so like that's probably a classic example of the blacks in America will say that they're oppressed and that's why they're poor. And then the whites in America will say that I don't know, you don't want to like get out there and get a job. Y'all just want to live off the government kind of thing. So those are both very racist things to say. I guess I need to defend that. Well, first of all, what the white people would be saying in that situation is obviously racist. They're saying you people are like this, and that causes your problems. As though a person doesn't have freedom of choice and freedom to make their own choices in life. But like, on the flip side, if you say that like, my situation is bad because there's this group of people out there who are holding me down, but you're saying the situation for my group of people, well, that's probably, you're going to say there's other race, there's some other race or other races that are holding your group down, and the whole reason your group has a problem is because of some racism. So like, essentially, if you say that all of those people hate me because of my race, then that's racism, because you are judging someone before you know them. Before you know, like, in other words, like, just because someone is not in your race, it doesn't mean that like they necessarily want to hurt you in any way. You are judging them before you know them. You don't know that like maybe they don't want to do that. So like that's racist. That's looking at somebody's race and saying they're my enemy. And you're not allowing them the basic biblical concepts. The fact that just because a person is a member of a certain race, it doesn't mean that they don't have the freedom of the will to make their own choices about how they want to live their life. And that they're free to make up their own mind. And so, ultimately, if that's true, if the gospel is offered to all, and if salvation is open to all, then in salvation from sin, deep down in someone's heart, then whatever problem you face in life, you may not be able to turn it into what you would like to have. So in other words, like, you may not be able to turn your poverty into riches, but you can overcome the problem. So like, if you look at Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those three guys were faced with a problem where in the nation that they were in, people said you have to bow down to this false god, and they refused to do it because they would only worship their God. And so they were thrown into a fiery furnace, as it says, which would be a super hot fire. So they would be burned up and die. But their position was, they were saved in a way, because they said, even if we die, we will follow God. So like, in their hearts, they were more free than all of those people who were slaves to bow down to that idol. They were the only free people there. And like, so they found a true salvation, and it didn't matter what their race was. In other words, like, that true salvation that's found only in Christ is offered to all. It's open to all. All are one in Christ. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and God doesn't want anyone in this world to perish. And so you're a human being, and salvation is open to you. It may not mean that your situation will be perfect. Jesus says, let's just go through it. Let's see. Matthew 5. Sermon on the Mount is hard to get more famous than this. Alright, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he even talks about verbal insults. It's not just physical punishment, but he says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, so this is valuable for what we're talking about here. You may be a member of you may be, it doesn't matter what your race is. Chances are in this life you're going to be put in a situation that victimizes you. Race or no race. You know, like what difference does it make at the end of the day what your race is? Because Jesus is saying no matter how bad your situation is, through Christ you can be blessed. Even through that bad situation. So like, and then he goes on to say, like, start talking about what he means. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world, a town built on a hill that cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in that house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. In other words, Jesus is preaching about a kingdom that's more important than whether or not you're poor, whether or not you're oppressed. You've got something more valuable than that in Him. You know, you might be, look at these things. You're poor in spirit, you're mourning, you're meek, you're hungry but thirsting for righteousness. You're merciful, you're pure in heart, you're a peacemaker, you're persecuted because of righteousness. In other words, I don't care what race you are. I don't care if like you were raised in the wrong idea all your life. You have the opportunity to receive the gospel. And the gospel is open to you. To be righteous is open to you. And even if people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of Christ, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. All right, so that's in the afterlife. But what are you here to do now? You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. You have a mission. This is your mission field. If you're in that situation where everyone is against you and the whole world is trying to victimize you, I don't care if it's about your race or whatever, or for whatever reason, but your life sucks because people are treating you like crap. Look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, but they were the only free people there. And then God miraculously saved them, and that was a key turning point in changing the king's heart over that. There were more he had to go through because God had to do a lot with that guy, but that was a big deal. He's going to change his mind about disrespecting that God when they survived it miraculously, and they said they didn't even smell of smoke, but the men who threw them in were burned up by the flames. But they were dancing in there. And you will be blessed in the kingdom of heaven. If you are a victim on this planet, you will be blessed in the kingdom of heaven. You have a mission to change the people who are victimizing you. You are the salt in their life. You are the light in their life. You're here to make a difference because Christ is with you. So, of course, Christianity has something to say about this. Now, if you're the person doing the victimizing and that kind of thing, Jesus said it like this. I think it's Matthew 21. Probably not the one I'm looking for. We're going to find it. Oh, I'm never going to find it. We're going to find it. Alright, hold on, we're going to find it. We're going to use the power of Google. Alright, so whoever gives a cup of water Matthew 10:42. I was way off. All right. Whoa. I got the wrong site there. So Matthew chapter 10. This is real looking up a scripture, right? Not, I'm pretending to look it up, but I've already got it marked. All right. It's not really the passage I was looking for. But it does say in Matthew 10:42, it does say it there. Anyway, if you give even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly that person will not lose their reward. Alright, Matthew 9. Oh, Mark 9. That's why I was confused. Part of why I was confused. Mark 9. Let's see. No, that's not the one. Oh, we gotta find this one. Well, I mean, the point doesn't have to be made explicitly. Right? Because I know. The wording is, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. One of Mother Teresa's favorite Bible passages. Alright. Let's look at the whole chapter. Alright. When the Son... Alright, so 31. Matthew 25:31. Turn on, I was closer in the... Alright. Went through a little journey there. Alright. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat." He's talking about God. God saying, "I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. And I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." The least. Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They will also answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger and needing clothes, or sick and in prison, and would not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So, there you go. So, the flip side of that is, if you're the one who is doing the oppressing and the victimization, you shouldn't be. The Holy Spirit produces in you love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control, not victimizing other people. Even Paul's a little bit there about slaves and masters, right? Do not threaten them, because the Lord is also your master, and he shows no partiality. So, I guess that's it. To sum up the last few points we went through about dealing with racism, you love your enemies, you pray for those who persecute you, you have to stop the boomerang from coming back at you, even if it's trivial. It's not your fault if someone evil benefits you. The question is what you do with what you're responsible for. So, like, if you benefit from intersectionality, who cares? The question is what you're going to do with what you have control over, what your property is in your life. Other people are going to do other stuff. But if you are aware that someone's like doing evil to benefit you, then you should probably not enable that or like encourage that by saying thank you, thank you, thank you, and that kind of thing. Whereas, but in Mother Teresa's case, I think it's clear like she was doing the right thing because she was helping the poor. Then, if you are a victimized group of any sort, know that Christ is not only going to bless you through that through Christ, you not only are you offered a blessing and a reward in the next life for enduring that for Christ, but you are the light of the world. You are offered a mission. You are the one who's there to change those people. You are not the victim. You are only there because Christ allowed you to be there, because he has a mission for you there. And then if you're the one doing the victimization, well, that's just a joke. You're not supposed to be doing that. All right. That is it. Thank you for your time.